Okay. Right. So, hi guys. Thank you so much for joining me and joining my guest today. So today we'll be speaking about a very interesting topic, which I'm sure a lot of people right now want to know about. We'll be speaking about the transition from life to death. And today's session is called the 12 Phases of Transition. And it's really important for us to kind of understand, especially with everything that's going on in the world. We've had, during this pandemic, quite a lot of people dying from all over the world. I'm sure a lot of people are starting to question themselves whether they believe us in the afterlife or not, what happens when we die. So, what happens to our loved ones when we die, what happens to our friends, our family who's transitioned. So I think it'll be really an interesting topic today to discuss this. And I'm really grateful to have, again, my favorite guest, Julie Ryan, who is a psychic and a medical intuitive for over 25 years now. And Julie has written a few books which are really incredible, one of which is called Angelic Attendants, What Happens as We Transition from this life. And Julie will actually be discussing this topic specifically today because quite a lot of people want to know what happens during this transition from life to death. Is there anyone who meets us on the other side? What happens to the person? Can we still communicate with them? So this is quite a topic to go over today. So I hope you guys can stick with us. And if you have any questions, make sure that you post them in the comments. So Julie, thank you so much for joining me again. How are you?
I'm thrilled to be here. We switched this from my channel, which is Ask Julie Ryan, because we were having some technical challenges. So, quick thinking, we put our heads together and we said, okay, let's go on your channel. So thank you for being so good with all this technical stuff, of which I know nothing about.
Yeah, next time this will be on Julie's channel, so make sure you also join her, Ask Julie Ryan, and that will all be on her channel. And there's already amazing sessions, episodes on there, so make sure you check them out as well. So yes, so 12 Phases of Transition is a very interesting topic, and I think probably quite a lot of people are not very familiar with it because, of course, many of us don't really question what happens when we die. We kind of tend to ignore this topic altogether because we don't want to think about it because we kind of think we're immortal most of the time. But tell me a bit about, for anyone who doesn't know your work, tell me a bit about your book, Angelic Attendants, and how did you come to write it?
Well, I have one right here. This is what it looks like, Angelic Attendants, what really happens as we transition from this life into the next. And how it came about, Desi, was when my mother was dying in 2002, I had studied to be a medical intuitive and psychic, and I was starting to do some of that work primarily on family and friends. And we got a call. My mother lived 8 hours from us. So we drove all through the night to get to her. My brother called and said, you need to get here. We live in the southern part of the US and she lived in the Midwest. So we got there, and as the day progressed, we got there on a Saturday. As the day progressed, she was in a hospice facility, and the nurses kept saying, she's just come from the hospital. She's well hydrated from all the IV fluids. And so she's probably going to last a week or two. And the family was all coming together, to be with her as she was dying. And so I thought, okay, fine. We were together, and I turned on my radar. I turned my abilities on and off at will. And it's like I have this X-ray or this MRI or CT scan in my head, so I can see what's happening in the spirit world, in my mind's eye, if you will. And the first thing that I saw was her spirit had exited her body, and it was held onto the top of the head, and it looked like a bubble in a cartoon caption where the words are, or the cartoon character's thoughts. And I thought, all right, this is going to be interesting. And then the next thing, my grandmother's spirit, who had just died 6 months prior, showed up. And then my grandfather's spirit, who had died in 1938, showed up. And then all these angels showed up. And the more I was watching, and this was over time, the more I was watching, I was thinking, oh my gosh. And it was interesting because here I am watching all this glorious stuff in the spirit world while my mother's dying, and it was heart-wrenching, obviously. And so as it progressed, and I saw these miraculous things happen, I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I wonder if everybody goes through this. And what I found out is everybody does. And since that time, I have worked with just literally hundreds of families who have a loved one who's dying. And I see this glorious component to what's happening as they're dying, how we're all surrounded by our deceased loved ones and spirits and angels. And so I coined it the 12 phases of transition. And everybody goes through all 12 phases, Desi, whether it happens instantly, like in the case of a homicide or a suicide, or whether it happens over days, weeks, months. We all go through it. And I think that it's interesting to remember that in the spirit world, there's no time. Time is a human invention. But these 12 phases are different configurations of angels and deceased loved ones. And even the spirits of deceased pets, our pets, spirits show up. It's really amazing. And it's how the configuration of how they are, I can tell how close to death the person is. And I can communicate telepathically with the person who's dying. And I have all kinds of stories about that I can tell.
Even when they're unconscious, right? So you can still
Exactly. When they can't communicate. One of my favorite stories, may I share it now? One of my favorite stories is I was working with a family whose father was dying, and he was quite elderly, and he was a retired dentist, and he was in intensive care, and they took him off life support. They took him off the ventilator, and they thought he would go quickly. Well, 2 weeks later, he's still there and still hadn't died, but still was unconscious. And the family kept saying to me, what does he need? What does he need? And he kept saying, I need them to file my quarterly estimated tax returns. His daughter was there. Are you kidding me? Really? Your dad, he's died. That can't be true. So after 2 weeks of this, she called me and she said, what does he need? I mean, this is crazy. Why is he hanging on? And I said, he's telling me he wants you to file his quarterly tax returns. So she said, I don't even know where they are. So I'm talking to her on the phone. I'm talking to him psychically, telepathically. And he said, they're in a desk in my bedroom, second drawer on the left or something like that. And I said to her, go to his house. Can you get in his house? And she said, yeah. I said, go to his house, see if they're there and mail them. I mean, you don't have anything to lose. So she did. And they were exactly where he said they would be, Desi. And she said they were addressed. They had the stamps on them. He had signed them, the check was there, and she mailed it. She dropped it in a mailbox on her way back to the hospital, and he died within the hour of her mailing those tax returns. And come to find out, she was the executor of his estate, and he wanted those filed because it made it so much easier to deal with his estate afterwards by having those taxes already filed. So he was waiting for that.
Yeah, weird thing. The last wish, but I guess it's one of those common things, like human things that we just can't let go. We don't want to leave the burden onto our families, so we want to make sure that that's.
I think also that that's a great example of how we all decide when we go, where we go, who's with us when we go, and what the circumstances are. Mm-hmm. And I find it fascinating that every funeral director of every funeral home on the planet has a million stories about the family sat with grandma for 2 weeks and Aunt Susie was on duty and she got up to get a cup of coffee and she was out of the room for 5 minutes and grandma died while Susie was out of the room. And so Aunt Susie, of course, is full of guilt because she's thinking, oh, she died and I wasn't there. Well, grandma orchestrated that. I mean, there are just there are millions of stories about how people have been with their loved one, and then when they're alone for a short period of time, they go ahead and they die whilst nobody's there. So we all decide when we go, how we go, who's with us when we go, and that helps really allay an awful lot of guilt with families who weren't with their loved one when they die. But really, nobody dies alone because we're all surrounded by angels and deceased loved ones.
Yeah. Oh wow. Yeah, I've heard so many of these stories actually that people tend to die when the family isn't in the room, and the 1 minute that they're actually out of the room, but I guess, do you think why do you think people choose that, to die this way? Do they not want their family to see them, or is it like
I think it depends on the person. When my grandmother died, she always said she didn't want to be a burden to anybody. And I was with her a half an hour before she died. My sister and her husband were with her 15 minutes before she died. She waited till everybody left the hospital and she checked out. And also, I was getting ready to fly home the next morning, and I said to her, I'll come see you on my way to the airport. And my dad said, well, she didn't want to inconvenience you and have you go home and then have to fly back for her funeral. So she did that, which is feasible, certainly. But the other thing with my mom, when my mom was dying, Desi, everybody was on their way to the hospice facility. And they, in fact, got there about 10 minutes after she passed. But her passing was tough. I know now that she wasn't medicated well, and I'm not so sure that it would have haunted them to see her, because she was kind of gasping for air at the end. But she knew I could see what was going on from a spiritual standpoint. And so she chose, I believe, to have me there. And she chose the rest of the family to come in right after she passed because it was easier on them. And I think that's a lot of it. I work with a lot of families who have an Alzheimer's relative or somebody with dementia who seems to hang on for long periods of time. I have a weekly podcast that's called Ask Julie Ryan, where people call in and ask Julie Ryan, ask me questions about all kinds of subjects. And I had a woman call into my show for two years, and her father, who was dying of Alzheimer's complications, he hung on for 2 years, and he was in phase 11 of 12. And what I hear from Alzheimer's patients a lot is that they're giving their families the opportunity to get used to them not being around. And this man in particular said he wanted to give his wife the opportunity to get used to him not being around. And I'm communicating with him telepathically, of course, because he's not able to communicate anymore. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, when I married my wife, she still lived at home, because back then, a lot of women did. She lived at home. We got married. We've been married 70 years or however long they'd been married. And he said, and she's never lived alone. So he took a long time to pass, because she would be at home by herself in the evenings and at night, and then she'd come back and she'd spend several hours during the day with him. So it was kind of easing her into this life of living alone, which I thought was really sweet. And I hear that a lot.
Yeah, it's kind of like they're still not able to completely let us go because they're worried about us and they want to make sure that we're okay and someone's taking care of us. Oh, well, actually, someone just commented that their fathers just died 2 days ago. So quite a, yeah.
Good timing. Well, I think to your point, in light of everything that's going on in the world right now, certainly in America with, around the world with the COVID pandemic, we're hearing about numbers of people who've died that we haven't seen in a long time. And it's scary and it's awful for the family members who are grieving. And certainly our heart goes out to them. And I think when someone we love dies, it makes us really pay attention to our own mortality and know, all right, I'm going to be in that shape someday. Mm-hmm. And that's what the whole quarantining was about with the COVID, was to prevent death, was people, okay, let's protect yourself so that you don't die. And it seems to have been successful in most parts of the world to a great extent, that the numbers are way less than what we thought they were going to be. But also with the George Floyd situation that's happening here in America, he died. And other people have died as a result, which is what the peaceful protests are about. And then the riots have broken out and people have been killed. Police officers have been killed. Other civilians have been killed, and lots of damage and destruction has happened. So I think it's a matter of, it's all about death. And we're all afraid, are we going to fly or are we going to fry when we die? We've been so conditioned by cultures and religions that you're either going to go to heaven or you're going to go to hell. And that's what scares people. And my big takeaway for everybody that's listening is everybody goes to heaven. There was a movie out several years ago that was called All Dogs Go to Heaven. Well, guess what? All people go to heaven too. So all of that throughout the ages of heaven or hell and the whole hell thing, I believe was put in place to control the masses. It was about control because what's the biggest motivator? Fear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fear.
Mm. Wow. And I mean, that's continued for hundreds of years. So that fear has really seeped into our consciousness, isn't it? Because that's what drives people to do crazy things and act in certain ways that they wouldn't be acting if they knew that, yeah, if they knew the truth. So tell us a bit more about what happens then when we die, because there's no hell. So, well, what about, I guess people at this point will be asking themselves, well, what about people who are killers and who are, rapists? What happens to them? How can they still go to heaven if they've done these really terrible things? How would you, what would be the explanation for that?
Every spirit, every soul, same thing, different word, same thing, same concept. Every spirit is the spark of the divine, and we're all based in love. So every spirit is pure love. All of the behavior that we see that's horrific at times is all part of the personality, and it stays with the person, stays with the body when somebody dies. So everybody's spirit is pure love and goes back to source, goes to heaven, if you will. And heaven is a reality as I see it that's all around us. It's not somewhere up in the clouds, where you go up and you sit on a cloud somewhere and you play with angels. I mean, certainly angels are around, but everybody's in non-physical. And our spirits all have their own frequency, Desi. So we can access past lives. We can access any spirit that's attached to a body, any spirit of a deceased loved one, just by thinking of them. And we tune into their frequency. It's as if our heads are big satellite dishes, and we tune into their frequency just by thinking of them. It's like when you're in the car and you click on a certain state radio station and you're hearing maybe classic rock. And then you click on a different radio station and you're hearing jazz or you're hearing classical music. It's the same thing. It's our frequency that's broadcast. So these 12 phases of transition, I believe, have been visible to people since the beginning of time. And as we've become more well-educated, we've become more proof-based, and we want proof that something happens, certainly in the last 100 years as we've become more literate.
Yeah.
And when I was researching in my book, The 12 Phases of Transition, when I was researching that, what I found is that it originated as a Gregorian chant in a prayer that's said at the end of every Catholic funeral called In Paradisum. And it talks about how the angels and your loved ones will greet you and lead you into paradise. And certainly back to that education thing, some of the most learned people were men in monasteries and in synagogues who were the keepers of the record. And maybe it took till the 5th century till someone was well educated enough, or people were well educated enough that somebody wrote this down. So I believe the 12 phases that I see have come about in a way through the generations, and we've just kind of tamped it down as we've become more well educated and more proof based.
So tell me about the first transition. What happens in that phase? The first phase of the transition.
The spirit exits the body and it holds on to the top of the head. It looks like a cartoon caption that you'd see the bubble in a cartoon where the cartoon character's thoughts or comments are. And that's where it stays. So I call that phase 1 when that happens. And then phase 2, what happens is the maternal spirit that's closest to the person who's dying, they show up. So if the dying person's mother is still alive, it's going to be his maternal grandmother. If his maternal grandmother is still alive, it's going to be his maternal great grandmother. So his maternal grandmother's mother. It's always on the maternal line when that happens. Oh, good. You put it up. All right. So there's phase 1. See, she is my technical director for a reason. Phase 1. So see how the spirit's in a cartoon caption. Can you go to phase 2?
Yeah. Let's do
See how you do that.
phase 2.
And these graphics, by the way, everybody, are on my website, askjulieryan.com. And certainly they're described in detail with lots of really heartwarming stories in Angelic Attendants, my book about this. So phase 2, the female spirit shows up and is always at the left foot of the person who's dying. So it's interesting because in Kabbalah, which is ancient Jewish mysticism, the left side of the body is the feminine, the right side of the body is the masculine. And so it's always the left side of the body. So in this graphic, the M stands for mother, the maternal spirit, and the F stands for father, or the paternal spirit. So we're looking at it so that, you know, we're facing the person and the mother's on the person's left side. So that's what that graphic is. So when that happens, then the next phase is phase 3. Can you see if you can get there?
Is it this one? Oh, no.
Phase 3. We're still in phase 1 is what's showing on my screen.
Oh,
Go to phase 3 if you can.
okay,
Phase
sorry.
3.
First time we're doing this.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'll talk about it when you get it up there. So phase 3 is when the angels come in, and the angels form a circle around the person who's dying, with the parents or the maternal, and there you go, maternal. So the mom is at the left foot, the father is at the person's right foot, and the circle of angels forms. And these are big old angels as I perceive them, Desi. They went through 12 years of Catholic schools, so they look like Catholic angels to me. You know, they're big, they got big wings, they got long hair, they got white gowns that are belted at the waist with rope. Is that what angels really look like? Who knows? That's how they appear to me, so I can recognize them. Somebody who was raised in a different religion or a different culture might see angels as a purple ball of energy or as some other shape or form, but that's just how I perceive them.
Yeah.
Is they look like angels that look like angels on a statue that we see.
It's down to your perspective, your personal perspective, more or less.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's phase 3. So see if you can go to phase 4, and then that'll detail what happens. As we get into phase 4, the angels form a horseshoe like that, good, and see how the circle has started to open. And I can scan anybody anywhere in the world real time, and I'll see one of these configurations, and I'll know, okay, they're in phase 4 or they're in phase 2 or whatever. And in the 12 phases of transition, obviously the closer they get to the 12th phase, which is they're leaving their body, they're detaching, and they're going to heaven. You know, we can say, all right, family, they're in phase 7. If you want to be there, you may want to come now, or certainly as they're getting closer to phase 12. In this day and age, people live far away. You know, families all don't live in the same city or the same village anymore. And sometimes people have to get on an airplane and travel long distances, or travel far in a car, take time off work, deal with school, deal with lots of other things. And so we find that it's really helpful. People, as I mentioned too, can go through these phases really quickly, or they can go through them over days, weeks, months, even years. Mm-hmm. And how quickly somebody's progressing through these phases, Desi, is gonna give us an indication of how they're progressing towards really transitioning and dying.
Mm. And at this point, you're still communicating with their spirit, so they can tell you what they want to do before they leave completely, or
right. I always ask 3 questions when somebody's dying, and I always say, are you ready to go? And they'll say yes or no. Are you in pain? What do you need? And I'll get all kinds of answers. Are you ready to go? That's yes or no, obviously. Are you in pain? Yes or no. And then sometimes I'll get more information with that. But what do you need can range from, I need a chocolate bar. Can you bring me chocolate candy? Or will you file my taxes? Or there was a woman in South Africa that I was working with, her and her family, and the grandmother was dying. Well, the family didn't know if she had a will, if she did, where it was. We get all kinds of information. I've even gotten information about, yeah, the will's in the safety deposit box in this bank on this street corner. Even that detailed we can get.
That's pretty detailed. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. That means at least, before they completely leave, we can still, complete their last death wishes. So that's pretty good.
That's right. And I get a lot of, would they like a service? Would they, or is there certain music that they would like sung at the service? Are there certain prayers that they'd like to be said? I get what kind of flowers. I mean, I've gotten what kind of flowers. There was a woman who was dying and she had brain cancer and she was not able to communicate for over a year. And she was very specific. She wanted yellow roses at her funeral. She wanted to wear this powder blue nightgown and robe, negligee kind of outfit when she was dying. She wanted to be buried in that. She wanted just her husband to lay in the bed with her when she was dying. I mean, she was very specific about what it was, and the family was able to give her everything that she asked for. It was really sweet. And so I went to the funeral. I went to the visitation hours and then the funeral right afterwards. And her husband came up and got me by the hand and he goes, "Look at all those yellow roses." He said, "I told the florist, if you have to spray paint white roses yellow, do it." And so, it was really sweet.
Wow. But I think, that must be such a relief though for the family who are not able to communicate with the person who's dying, because, of course they want to make sure that they provide them with everything that they need so they can die peacefully. So that must be such a relief for people to, to have someone who can communicate like you and to pass on their messages. So
There
yeah.
was a family with whom I was working in Athens, Greece, and the husband was dying, and he was a retired admiral in the Greek Navy, and he was not able to communicate. And I said, "What do you need?" And he said, "I need to talk to my sister." So I said to his wife, "He wants to talk to his sister. Has his sister come to visit him?" And she said, "No, they're estranged." And I said, "Can you at least get her on like a Facebook Live or a FaceTime, excuse me, a FaceTime Live, so they, or a Skype, so that she lived in Australia and he was in Athens, and so they were able to do that, and then he passed the next day. So even requests like that, and certainly I get requests from people who are dying who are still able to communicate, but maybe don't feel comfortable in asking for something, or the family isn't comfortable in saying, "Is there anything you need? Is there anything I can get for you?" Because it's so hard when you're going through the death, the dying, and the subsequent death of somebody that you love. Oftentimes it's just families don't know what to do. So I can communicate with the person who's dying, whether they're lucid or not.
Oh wow. And it must be also, do you find that it's also a relief for the person who is dying that they can actually communicate with someone? And because I'm guessing, the family would normally not be aware of any of that. But if they bring you in, then obviously the person's probably wanting to say, "I love you" to their family, or "I'm sorry," or something like that. So kind of like
Yeah.
balance.
And there are all kinds of stories in angelic attendance about families with whom I've worked, and they're all heartwarming, and they all have different nuances to them, and miraculous things happened. And I always tell the family when their loved one is dying, look for the miracles along the way, because they're there. You just look for them, pay attention. And they all have stories about, "Oh my gosh, this person showed up at the right time," or "We weren't able to find something that my mother was wanting and asking for, and then all of a sudden one of the daughters dreamt about it and woke up the next morning and she knew where it was, and she went and she found maybe a prayer book or a whatever that they wanted." But it's really remarkable how people are able to see people who are dying. A lot of people who are dying, research has shown this, they're able to see their deceased loved ones, and pets a lot of the times too. Hospice information, either in the hospice centers or in home care hospice, even in hospitals, most of the hospice literature will say, expect your dying loved one to say that they're seeing maybe their parents who've been dead for 50 years, or other deceased loved ones, sometimes religious figures, sometimes other people who are friends and colleagues and acquaintances that show up. So that happened with my mother when she was dying, these spirits of these people that had been dead for 20 and 30 years that I hadn't thought of in all these decades, their spirits showed up, and I thought, whoa, I can't make this stuff up. And dogs spirits that we had when we were children, when my siblings and I were children, they were there, and they'd been dead for 25 years. And I'm thinking, really? Frosty, our white German Shepherd, was there. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I can't make this stuff up. It was really remarkable, and it opened my eyes to really the glorious side of what's happening. And nobody ever dies alone. We're always surrounded by angels and deceased loved ones and our pet spirits. So phase 5 is what's happening is that Horseshoe is opening up further, Desi.
Yeah.
And if you want to show that, yeah. So you can see that the Horseshoe is expanding. And if you want to go to phase 6, that's when other spirits start to arrive. And it's interesting, between phase 5 and phase 6, notice that there's an angel on either side of the spirit bubble. That's what I call this bubble. Well, you'll find out as we go through the other stages, and when it gets closer to departure time, those spirits have a very crucial role in helping the person transition. And it's interesting too, I always find that the family and friends spirits show up behind the line of the angels and the maternal and the paternal spirit that's closest to the person who's dying. And see the S, the purple S, that's where the person's spouse is always positioned.
Oh.
If the spouse precedes them in death. And I get questions, well, what happens if I've had 5 husbands? Well, they're all there. And the most recent spouse is always at a diagonal from the mother spirit.
Oh, okay.
Diagonal is always, as we're looking at the person, it's southeast. It's a southeast diagonal.
Is there a specific reason for that?
Pardon me?
Is there a specific reason for that it's always on the left?
I don't know. I have no idea, but that's just where I always see them. So the FF stands for family and friends. Sounds like a cell phone ad, doesn't it? Family and friends. Yeah. But I wanted to come up with a graphic where we could look at it and we could see instantly, okay, this makes sense. I can see what's happening. The other thing that I find fascinating is there have been so many people throughout the years who've talked about near-death experiences.
Yeah.
And lots of validation, lots of research that these people, there's no way they could know of things that were happening maybe in the hospital room or in the operating room or in people who were there, and they recount conversations after they were supposedly dead, and they've got it cold. They know what was said, who was saying it, the whole 9 yards. But they talk about going through a tunnel, a lot of them, that they'll see a tunnel. And I believe that's what's happening when that spirit is exiting the body in phase 1 and then hangs on to the top of the head as a cartoon caption, because their spirit's still there and it's still attached to the body, but they're able to see what's happening around them. I mean, the ability to recount what transpired. Paramedics came in, did CPR on me, whatever those circumstances were, I find quite remarkable. And I find that these 12 phases of transition really correlate with what people that report near-death experiences claim. The other thing about the near-death experiences that I find fascinating is that regardless of culture, education, religious upbringing, language, whatever, they seem to be the same. There's a pattern that all of them go through, and it's very similar, if not the same, across the world, regardless of culture.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well from all the stories that I've heard. All the stories have so many similarities, whether they're in Africa or in Southeast Asia. Yeah, they're all kind of say the same thing. Yeah.
Right. So let's go to phase 7, because that's when the animal spirits start to show up, and they are, I call it the dog pound. It's over on the right. See where the little orange peas are? That's where the animal spirits hang out. And it's every animal that that person has had in their lifetime. And what's really fun, Desi, is sometimes I'll see someone who's dying and there's all these farm animals in the room. There could be horses and cows and pigs and chickens and ducks and, stuff like that. And I'll say to the person who with whom I'm communicating, the family member, I'll say, okay, did your mom grow up on a farm, or does your sister live on a farm? And I'll describe what the pets look like, or what the farm animals and other dogs and cats look like, and other snakes and whatever. And they'll say, yeah, that was, Bessie, her cow, or that was Molly, her Australian Shepherd dog, or whatever. When my own mother was dying, I was seeing these spirits of dogs that I didn't know who they were. And at her funeral, my uncle and aunt flew in, her brother, she only had one sibling. And I was describing these dogs to him. And he goes, oh, yeah, that was Rusty and that was Rowdy. And that even he knew right away who they were, which is really, so many people are pet lovers. And it gives them lots of comfort to know that their pet spirits are with them as they're dying and when they transition, but also their pet spirits are with them while they're alive. And there are many, many, many stories about someone saying, gosh, I feel like I can hear my dog who died last week coming down the hall, or I felt like my cat cuddled up to me on the couch as I was watching TV. And that's that pet letting them know that they're there, that they're close by, which is really sweet. So phase 8, the horseshoe continues to expand, and more family and friends come in. And yeah, it's a lot. But if you go to phase 9, Desi, that's when it gets interesting, because many spirits arrive, but then by phase 10, that's when those angels on either side of the spirit bubble between phase 9 and phase 10, those angels, as I perceive it, their wings start to move. And it's this really slow moving, rhythmic motion. It reminds me of a giant owl. If you want to go to phase 10, please.
This is it?
Yeah. Are you on phase 10 now?
Yeah.
No, you're on phase 9, I think. Go to phase 10.
Maybe it's.
Yeah. If you can go to phase 10, please. There you go. Yeah. So their wings start to move, and it creates this vortex above the person's head. And it looks like a funnel cloud, like a tornado cloud. And the first time I saw it, of course, was with my own mother. And I thought, oh my goodness, I haven't been drinking or taking any drugs. Not that I do, probably, I never do. But I thought, oh my goodness, what is this? And what was happening was that vortex was forming above her head, and it had an upward pull to it. I could feel it was like a vacuum. It reminded me of being in my car and going through the car wash. At the end of the car wash, they turn on these big dryers and it sucks all the water off your car as you're going out of the car wash. It's just what it reminded me of. And I thought, well, this is going to be something to watch this and see what happened. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but I knew that it was very significant when this happened. And these angels' wings, Desi, remind me of a giant owl. If you've ever seen maybe a documentary or a story, like on Animal Planet or on a story, National Geographic or something, where those wings, they're silent, but you could almost feel the drag when an owl is flying. Yeah. And if you want to go ahead and go to phase 11, please. I'm so glad you know how to do this, because I have no clue.
I'm glad I can do this as well.
So delighted that you know how to do this. All right, so here's phase 11. So the wings are still moving, and there's like a hole that opens from this vortex. It opens a hole above the person's head, and that's what the spirit uses. The spirit eventually is going to go through that vortex, and that hole helps detach the spirit from the body. It's interesting, when I was researching angelic attendants, just for kicks, I Googled giant owl wings vortex, and I got all this information. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of hits of what's called the wingtip vortex, which I'd never heard of, but apparently it's something that happens with all flying anything, insects, animals, planes, jets, gliders, kites, that this vortex forms and it looks like this. It looks like a funnel cloud underneath it, and it's what causes lift. I mean, there are thousands and maybe tens or hundreds of thousands, I don't know what the number is, but there are thousands and thousands of aeronautical engineering drawings and different websites that one can go to learn about the wingtip vortex. And I thought, well, for heaven's sakes, literally these angels' wings are moving, they're causing this vortex, which causes this upward lift, and it helps the spirit separate from the body. I thought that was just incredible when that happened. When I learned of that, I think I squealed out loud in my office. I went, "Oh my God!" when I learned that. It's so fun to find things that are scientifically based that corroborate things that I'm seeing in the spirit world in my mind's eye when that happens. So go to the last one, please, phase 12. And
also where the crown chakra is, isn't it? The top of the head, and that's where we are supposedly escape, with the our spirit. So
right, and connected to the divine. Yeah, and the crown chakra, you're absolutely right. So phase 12 is the spirit separates from the body. It's escorted by angels, and as I perceive it, it's always up and to the right is where the spirit goes. And it's interesting because it's depicted in a lot of old masters' paintings, where if somebody's dying and angels are carrying a spirit. If you research that, you'll see oftentimes they're depicted up and to the right, which goes back to my earlier comment about, I believe people have been able to see this since the beginning of time. And it's just, we got away from it as we became more well-educated. And then heaven looks to me like this big plasma wall. I don't see any stone gates with St. Peter sitting there with a checkboard, with a clipboard, and he's checking off names and saying, okay, well, are we going to let you in or not? I haven't seen that in all these years I've been doing this work, but it reminds me of a plasma wall that when you go through it, the plasma, it just goes back to normal. And it's just as far up and below and as far side to side as I can imagine is this plasma wall. And last weekend, my husband and I watched the movie Contact with Jodie Foster. Have you seen that movie?
Yeah.
It's old.
Yeah.
I think it was out maybe 20 years ago. But in that movie, when she's on a different planet, it's depicted as a plasma existence. And I had forgotten that part of the movie. And I said to my husband, oh my gosh, that's what I see with heaven, is it's this plasma-like energy that is the going through that wall. And then on the other side of the wall, it's always their deceased loved ones and family are there waiting for them. So it's really fascinating to see that. As someone is getting towards the end in the final phases of the 12 phases of transition, there are so many spirits there that are present, Desi, that they look like dots on the horizon. They go out in both directions. They go out from the person who's dying, but that line of angels anchored by the maternal and the paternal spirit is almost like a line of demarcation between our reality and the spirit world reality. I call it angelic crowd control. and then I call these family and friends that are there the welcome to heaven committee. So they're there to welcome the person back to non-physical, back to heaven, which is where we all hang out. It's just called heaven by a lot of cultures.
Wow, that's so beautiful to hear and to know that every person who dies are met by their loved ones and angels, so they're not alone at all.
Ever. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that's interesting about how this all came about is my spirit guide is a pope called Pope Clement VI. And he showed up one day when I was with my mentor and showed up in his whole Pope outfit and his hat and the whole 9 yards. And I said, well, who are you? And I said, I'm Clement. He said, I'm Clement. And I said, there was a Pope Clement? And he said, yeah, I was number 6. And I thought, okay, never heard of you, but that's okay. Imagine that, I haven't heard of any of the 6 of you. And so I said, well, may I help you? Basically, what can I do for you? And he said, you are supposed to teach the world about what happens when somebody dies because people are so afraid and there's no reason for them to be afraid. It's easier than being born. It's just you slip into non-physical. And he said, and there's a glorious component to it. And that's your part of one of your reasons why you were born is to teach the world about what happens. And I said to him, I said, I'm not doing that. I'm a businesswoman. Are you crazy? People think I'm nuts. I'm not doing that. She said, yeah, whatever. So I went out to get in my car to go home. And I Googled just for kicks, Pope Clement VI. And I found out he was in office during the bubonic plague or the Black Plague when 2/3 of Europe died in the 14th century. And he's best known for his prayers for the dying and his prayers for the dead. And I thought, okay, Ryan, you can't make this up. This Pope spirit shows up and says you're supposed to teach the world. So it took me several years to get the courage to release this in a book. And even to the point where one Sunday, my husband and our son was in high school, I think at the time. I was sitting between them in church. And the priest from the pulpit said, wouldn't it be interesting if we really knew if angels and our deceased loved ones greet us and escort us to heaven when we die? And I'm getting elbowed, by my husband and my son. And I'm thinking, okay, God, really? From the pulpit, you're giving me grief about this? And so I finally released the book, and it's been so well received. It's used in Sunday school classes around the country, around the US, of all denominations. It's used in synagogues. It's given as a gift to people who have a loved one who's dying. It's given as a gift to people who've just lost a loved one. And my church actually gives it to every family that comes in to plan a funeral. The other thing about the 12 phases of transition is you can download them from my website for free. And what families are doing is they'll put them together in a folder. And when family members come to visit whoever's dying, they'll just give them the folder and let them look through it. And I hear from so many families all over the world that just looking at these graphics gives them so much peace because they know they can tell in less than a minute, they can tell in a couple seconds by looking at a graphic that their loved ones surrounded by angels and their deceased loved ones and even their deceased pets. And it just calms frayed nerves. There's the woman I was telling you about that wanted to die in the blue negligee with the yellow roses. She came from a large Italian family, and her sister-in-law called me the night she was dying, and she said, there are 100 people in this house, family members. And when somebody walks in the door, we hand them the chart of the 12 phases of transition. And she said, normally these people would be bouncing off the walls. They'd be, sobbing and wailing and all of that. And she said, everybody's peaceful. Everybody's has a sense of joy about what's happening to this woman. And that was just such a wonderful thing for me to hear. So Pope Clement prodded me for years, and I finally got this information out. And that's why we wanted to do that today, because of all that everybody's going through, both here in the US and abroad, with all of this talk of death, and everything's about death. We're all scared to death of death.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really. So I wanted to get this information out about about a different perspective. Certainly it doesn't lessen the grief. It doesn't lessen what families go through when they lose a loved one, but it gives it a glorious side of the equation that can help comfort at a time when people most need it.
Yeah, definitely. And you described that really brilliantly in your book, because there's so many different examples of people that you've worked with. So it really helps to kind of get a good idea of exactly how it happens and what happens afterwards as well. So guys, if you do have any questions, make sure you write them down. We still have another few minutes left. But I do want to ask you, so what about people, for example, mass killings, bombs that go off or things like that, or during the wars? What do does the same thing apply? So every person has the angels surrounding them, their loved ones surrounding every single person.
Yep. And remember, there's no time in the spirit world. So time is a human invention, a human concoction, which is hard for us to wrap our heads around. Well, how can all these phases happen all at the same time when somebody dies instantly? But when you can go back and remember there's no time in the spirit world, it happens instantly. So it's a different way of thinking about it, instead of for us, okay, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But by having these different phases, I think it makes it easier for us to understand from our human perspective what's going on. And certainly it avails us of information that helps when people are traveling long distances and taking time off work and taking kids out of school to go be with a loved one who's dying.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That's a comforting thing to know. And someone's just asked, well, so Mina Rolando said, my mom suddenly passed away in her sleep. Is the transition the same?
Yes, always the same for everybody. Yes. And the other thing I think it's important to know too is that we all can talk with our deceased loved ones. And how that works is you say something to them, even if you say it aloud or in your head, it doesn't matter. And spirits communicate telepathically. So it's going to be within a second of you asking a question, you're going to get a thought. You're going to think, oh, God, that's my head. That's my brain. How you tell that it's somebody else, it's your loved one. Remember, our heads are satellite dishes. When we think of them, we're tuning to their frequency, their spirit's frequency, like tuning a radio dial on a radio in the car radio. So you say something to them, either a statement or a question, and their answer is going to come in as fast as you can snap your fingers within a second. If it takes more than a second, then that is your brain talking to you. And the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. If you're looking for advice, remember to be super specific, because spirits are really literal. They're always going to give us the correct answer. How applicable it's going to be is going to be based on how we ask the question. For instance, if you say, well, I enjoy the concert, and you get a yes, and then you're watching a concert on TV and you're saying, ah, this is terrible. I don't want to watch this. I don't care for this kind of music. This isn't what I thought it was going to be. And so you say to your loved one, well, why did you tell me I'd enjoy the concert? You're thinking, okay, I got bad information. Versus had you asked the question, am I going to enjoy the concert on Saturday, June 6th of 2020 at 8 p.m. on the BBC of Sir Paul McCartney? I mean, be that specific, and then you're going to get information that's going to be more usable and applicable. And you can ask follow-up questions. So keep refining the question if you're looking for advice. And it will always come in. You don't have to just ask spirits that you know or that you knew when they were alive. I mean, you can ask whoever. You can ask Mother Teresa, Napoleon. I mean, it doesn't matter. Anybody, Einstein, anybody you think of. As soon as you think of them, you're on their frequency and they'll answer you.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, yeah, actually, so there's a few people online who communicate with spirits of famous people, and they kind of channel their messages. So it's quite interesting to see what you get actually, and it really resonates with, you know, the person that you think they are, and that, yeah. So that's quite interesting. We have another question from David Bottas. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Does the spirit decide before birth when they will pass, or do we constantly have free will to decide since the future is fluid?
Great question. It's answer B. It's that we always decide. We choose when we go, where we go, how we go, all of that. I think COVID is a great example of, we've certainly seen lots of elderly people that have died during the COVID epidemic in not just Italy, but in all over the world. And most of those people, if not the vast majority of them, had comorbidity issues, whether they had diabetes or heart failure or something else that was a problem. And they chose to go out in that manner. So they chose to go out during the COVID epidemic. Perhaps they contracted COVID and they thought, okay, this is a good time for me to exit. And that's what they did, which
But
is hard, again, for us to comprehend in our human minds. Certainly, this is a paradigm shift of what we've all been led to believe. But it's what I find over and over and over again every time that I communicate with a person who's dying and or somebody who's died and the family of the person who's died.
yeah, and I think it's really important to remember that it's always a choice. Whether they died, whether they were killed in a car crash or whether they died from cancer for over 2 years, it's still their spirit deciding that this is the time for them to go, right?
That's right. The spirit, and what happens, Desi, is spirits say, okay, I've explored everything I wanted to explore. I want to go back to non-physical, and then I want to cook up another group of things that I want to explore. And then they reincarnate and they come back and they explore that. So back to the time doesn't exist in the spirit world. What we think of a lifetime, maybe a long life would be 100 years. Certainly it would be in our reality. In the spirit world, it may not even be a blip on the radar screen.
Yeah, because there is no time or space in the spirit world, right?
That's right.
We have another question from Nirvana Bliss. I have seen an energy vision board open in front of me, then never after. The question is why it happened and why. Why it happened. A vision board, energy vision board. I'm not sure what that is.
I'm not sure what that is either. See if she'll give us some more information.
Okay, Nirvana, do you want to explain further about the vision board? Yeah. And we have Vivier. She said, I had a psychic reading which says before my dad passed away, psychic relayed message that it wasn't his time yet. So I was really shocked that when he left. Oh, okay. So the psychic said that it wasn't his time yet, but he died anyway. Yeah. Well, I guess psychics. I mean, it depends who you go to, right? Because psychics are not always correct.
Well, I think too, it's open for interpretation. So what I was talking about, it's how the question and how the information comes in, and certainly we filter it through our own life experiences and our own beliefs and judgments and things like that. So it wasn't his time yet. Might have been that it could be a whole bunch of explanations. It could be that he changed his mind and decided to exit, like what I was just using as an example for some of the COVID patients that had died. It could be that he felt that he was done doing everything that he wanted to explore. And so he thought it might take more time to do that. I mean, there can be a whole bunch of different explanations for that. So I don't know that that's a wrong answer. I think the interpretation is open to evaluate from a lot of different perspectives.
Yeah, and yeah, like you said, free will. I mean, yeah, the spirit can always change their mind, I guess. And maybe if they're suffering, maybe that also makes a difference as to whether they
I
want to
find
come.
that I find that a friend of mine, her grandson died, and he had a addiction problem. He had a opioid problem, and when we talked to him after he died, he said, I was just so tired of not being able to get over this addiction. And I felt like it was just too much of a slog, my word. It was just too hard, number one. And number two, he said he knew how hard it was on the family. So he made the decision to go. And he got some weird infection, and he was in the hospital, and his organs shut down from the infection. So he didn't die of an overdose. He died from the infection. And we talked to him about that telepathically, Desi, and he said he felt that would be easier for his family if he died from an infection in the hospital and from a medical condition rather from an overdose, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess an overdose is, I guess that would make maybe the family blame itself for.
Well, I think the stigma of that is different from my son or my grandson died from a blood infection, and he went into organ failure. And that's culturally how we perceive different ways to die. Certainly suicide has been throughout the generations just really a tough a tough way for families to deal with somebody dying. But if you think about, we all decide when we go, where we go, how we go, who's with us when we go, all of that, really all death is a form of suicide because we're deciding to go
Yeah.
in that manner. And I think that puts a different spin on it and from a different perspective when we look at it that way. And it certainly can, when I work with families who have a loved one who's passed from suicide, I always talk with them about that. My neighbor across the street, her husband committed suicide last spring. And I said that to her. I said, really, we all decide when we go and where we go and all of that. And so it's all truly a form of suicide when we die. And that gave her a lot of peace.
That's a good way to look at it, yeah. And it's true because we do decide. So yeah, okay, I think we got an answer from, okay, so Nirvana said an energy window that opened in front of me that is non-physical. Okay, so I think she's talking about some sort of an energy bowl or something, window, I don't know, that she has been able to see. So does that, I guess, does that mean anything? Like a portal, I guess?
She's just, well, it's when I say I'm seeing things in my mind's eye, like if I'm scanning somebody for a medical intuitive scan, it's like I have an MRI in my head or an X-ray. And so it's just being able to perceive other realities in different frequencies is what she's doing. So you go, girl, you need to enroll in my class. Tell her enroll in my class. I teach a class 4 times a year called Angelic Attendant Training and teach people how to communicate with spirit. And Desi, you know, you're a graduate of the class, but we learn how to do medical intuitive stuff. We can do past life stuff. We can scan animals. We can talk to deceased loved ones. We can talk to anybody that's deceased. We can, I don't know, what else do we do? All of that. And it's a matter of you tap into spirit, you validate, you learn to validate the information that you get, and it really, you can take it in any direction that you want. Anything you want to say along those lines? I mean, you can tell how close to death somebody is, which comes in really handy, and you can do it with anybody anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's pretty incredible. I have to say, really open my mind to so many possibilities of what we can actually do. And it's really, yeah, I think we're just, like you said before, we are in this phase now where we're starting to learn that there is something outside of this physical reality. So I think this is a really good time for everyone to just not only ask the questions, but start to test these things for themselves. And, you know, when we feel energy around us, if we want to communicate with our loved ones. And yeah, with you, it definitely, I was able to kind of expand my mind and learn how to actually do that, how to tune my frequency and yeah, communicate, see people's, you know, any medical issues that they have going on. Although I have to say, I'm still not sure if I can do that properly, but yeah, I'm learning.
Day, I watched you. You were fabulous in what you did, and that's part of it too. Is we as humans tend to doubt the information that comes into our heads, and we think, oh, that's just my imagination, or that's not really happening. And it's learning to trust that it is really happening and it is valid and you're able to do it. Everybody comes in with the ability. It's just learning to enhance and develop it. And that's what we do in the class. So anybody that's interested in the class, my July class is full, but I'll do another one in the fall, and you can learn more about it at askjulieryan.com.
askjulieryan.com. And you also do every Thursday night, you do a radio show where people can call in and ask questions as well. So that's a really good one for anyone who wants to know more about this, or if you have a relative who is in the transitional phase, then definitely a good way to find out how they are, what they want. So yeah, definitely recommend.
That's right. We tape, it's a live taping. We tape it on Thursday nights. And in the UK, it's late. It's 8 Eastern in the US. So what is that? It's like 1 a.m. your time, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. But it's fun. And also people can submit questions online, and a question is chosen each week that I answer. And that ends up being the title of the show. But the show is anywhere from 8 to, I think I got 15 on Thursday night, a couple days ago, where we got 15 people on, and they ask questions from, can you scan me for, I'm having these medical symptoms, to, can you scan my dog? Can we talk to my deceased mother? Can you tell how close so-and-so is to dying? Can we do a past life thing? Can we talk to spirit guides? It's just all across the board. Am I going to marry this person? Am I, is it in my best interest to take this job? Is it in my best interest to move to this new city? Is it in my best interest to buy this car? It's a blast. We have so much fun. It's all across the board, the questions.
And
It's Ask Ryan. You can find it on any podcast network. Apple, Stitcher, iHeart, anywhere you download podcasts, you'll find Ask Julie Ryan.
That's Julie Ryan, great. And we'll also be doing these sessions on your YouTube from next month onwards, right? So you'll be doing a lot of workshops, training online on YouTube. So if anyone wants to know more about Julie's work, then definitely join her channel. We'll be doing a lot more of these from the next month coming on. So yeah.
And send us questions. If there's something that you want, that you want to cover, or you want us to cover, send it to us. Go through askjulieryan.com and send us a note through the website. And we'd love to hear from you and love to hear what you'd like for us to cover, because I got my sidekick now who's going to help me with this. And I so appreciate all your technical abilities, Miss Desi.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you for covering this important topic as well. I know a lot of people are going to benefit from it, from learning a bit more about what happens to our loved ones when they do die. And yeah, it's just such an important topic. And I think from now on, people are just going to be, finding out a lot more about this stuff, because I think now is a time when we're finally starting to realize that there's a lot more than this physical reality. So this is definitely a great one to cover. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you guys next month for the next YouTube live on Julie's channel. So make sure you join us live there. Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.